also happy that I don't have to speak about founding the new party, which notoriously is the $1 million question, but maybe the dollar is losing currency. But I want to pick up and kind of goes into the direction of failing to build a viable left in the past. When Gary said, we are fighting TPP, I think we should have fought TPP, but we didn't. I didn't live in this place of the world at the time, but I'm told there were masses of buses going down Seattle and there was a battle. I don't think it was really a battle, but there was a significant movement against NAFTA, I hear. There was a significant movement against WTO. But there isn't now. And most recently, there was some fascination with CETA. And you all know now about the small region of the small country of Belgium, which is called the Wallonie, or Wallonia. And everybody on the left was cheering towards opposition coming out of Wallonia against this Canada-Europe trade agreement. But there isn't really a movement against neoliberal globalization coming from the left. Well, if you create a vacuum, you don't need to be surprised if somebody else starts filling that vacuum. Like Gary, I think the F word is overused. It's largely a swear word. If you don't like capitalism, you say, I don't like capitalism, but if you really don't like it, you call it fascism, and it's much worse. And besides, often the anti-capitalist agenda kind of falls off the radar screen as soon as you bring in a rather undifferentiated F word. Luckily, the political center brought in a new word, the P word. It's the buzzword coming out of the political center, populism. And I do make the argument that drawing on that term is more useful than using the F word. But what am I talking about here? What is populism? Well, if you don't like NAFTA or the WTO or CETA, then you must be a populist. This is what you hear from the political center over and over again. That's what you heard during the Hillary Clinton campaign. That's what you would hear in Canada if there was a similar movement, somebody running on a Trump ticket. What's interesting, the talk about populism coming from the political center reinvents the idea that left and right are essentially the same. Older people, older comrades might remember totalitarianism. Left equals right, neither of them is liberal, therefore both are bad and they're both the same. The updated version delivers us a list of populists, they're all bad. And the list includes, naturally, Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, Vladimir Putin, Hugo Chavez. Sometimes Bernie Sanders is mentioned, not very often. What is never mentioned is Occupy Wall Street, which is was a left populist movement par excellence, and it's not a surprise that mainstream media is quite happy not to remind anybody that this is actually where the excitement for Bernie Sanders originally came from, a left populist movement. I take the freedom to tell people that if they think that it's too Western-centric to leave out the peripheries of the world, there's a fine new book here called The Three Worlds of Social Democracy. It looks at all parts of the world, not just the Western world, and it does make the argument essentially that populism is what you get not only if the revolution fails, but you get it when social reform fails. If you want slogans, you get fascism if the socialist revolution fails, you get right-wing populism if social reform fails. My argument actually is, don't look at the 1930s to understand today's situation, look at the 1970s. The 1970s were a time when something I would call neoliberal populism started to arise. back in the 1970s, what was the condition then? You had kind of politics centered around class, very much so. Not always talked about in that language, but in fact very much so. The welfare state was, if you will, the institutionalized class compromise. It had enshrined the successes of social reform. At the same time, you had a fairly vibrant left that openly advocated class struggle, often very critical of the welfare state, saying it's just another form of the capitalist state which needs to be destroyed. Other people on the left openly advocating class struggle said, well, the welfare state was just a starting point and now it's time to move the whole thing further to the left. But you also had people on the left at the time who said, well, class is obsolete. Somehow it has disappeared into thin air. So you had kind of three brands of class discourse on the left. One was the institutionalized welfare state, one was advocating class struggle, and one was denying its relevance. Not exactly a united front on the left of any kind, and this is exactly what made it kind of prepared the ground for neoliberal populism, which effectively translated the class language of workers against bosses into a language of taxpayers, i.e. the hard-working people, against corrupt elites. And guess who the corrupt elites were? Not exactly the 1%, the ones that were mentioned typically were the bureaucrats running the welfare state and the unions. And the promise of neoliberalism was, we liberate you should liberate yourself from state interference. Well, this very much picked up those currents on the left who thought class struggle was a thing of the past in the first place, and liberation, particularly individual liberation, was everything. I very much like the idea of individual liberation, but I do see how neoliberals were good at it, turning it into the most effective ideology, most effective religion in recent history. The promise was just get the state and the union bosses off your back, and then you can show what you can do in the market game. This is exactly how Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher won their victories. And yes, later people found out, just like today about Donald Trump, yeah, there were working class people voting for these people. The big difference, of course, was at the time of the victories of Reagan and Thatcher, people could still believe that they really can show what they can do in the market game. And the troubles just started a few years later when more and more people found out that, yeah, there's a neoliberal market game, but most of them playing it are losers, and the ones, working class people, hoping that they could also make it in the market after being suppressed by the welfare state for such a long time, they found themselves on the side of the losers. So that after not so many years, actually, the welfare state that had created not only frustration amongst middle-class new left radicals, but also amongst working-class people who were just tired of having to fill out forms to get this, having to fill out forms to get that. A few years into the neoliberal game, the welfare state, despite all its bureaucracy, became more and more popular again. Just at that time, kind of the world had changed. It was too late. You couldn't get back the welfare state that you got used to, that you didn't like very much for a while, and that now you wanted to get back. Because under the guise of the neoliberal market game, what had happened was neoliberal globalization, bypass the union organizer, reorganize the firms, move production elsewhere where there is no unions. On the other side of the world, the Soviet Union had collapsed, which always had kind of an outside impact on bargaining power of working class organizations in the West. So you end up in a situation where people want a welfare state. It's very popular. Neoliberalism at the same time is unpopular, but the welfare state is not on the agenda, at least not in terms of getting it back like we used to, simply because there's not the power to push through the kind of, to get back to the level of social protections that we have seen in the Western world until the 1970s. This is exactly the situation where people want a welfare state. The left is not able to deliver upon the hopes of bringing back the welfare state. This is the condition where right-wing populism wins big time. It maintains the language of neoliberal populism, hard-working people, i.e. taxpayers exploited by elites. But now with a twist. The bailed-out bankers get mentioned as much as the welfare mothers. Welfare mothers have always been a prime target of neoliberal populism, along with the union bosses and the welfare state managers. Now you have to mention the bailed-out bankers because they got so much money after the 2008 crisis that it's quite obvious. You can't just say, sorry, there is no money for a kindergarten when there's millions for the bankers. So right-wing populists have to present themselves as tendering to working people and taking on the bailed-out bankers. Of course, in reality, they don't. They denounce them sometimes, but then the most prominent representative of right-wing populism these days, Donald Trump, of course, is a multimillionaire. He is the establishment, no matter what he says, and he was quite good for a while, kind of to distract people from the fact that he's not exactly in a position to present himself as anti-establishment. And this, of course, is one of the open flanks for right-wing populists. Some of their leaders are really part of the establishment, and they try to cover up their commitment to the establishment, to being part of the 1% or wanting to be part of it, by ramping up cultural counter-revolution. If I said fascism is about counter-revolution, let's say a real counter-revolution, right-wing populism very much is about a cultural counter-revolution. Stir up hate against people who look differently, who think differently, who pray to different gods than the ones that you say are the ones everybody needs to pray for. But it's a large-scale distraction from the commitment of right-wing populism to the neoliberal agenda. But of course, that has the problem that the 1% sticking to its neoliberal agenda really has no interest in the populist policies. The neoliberal agenda wants migration. It's the way to keep wages down, which actually includes some tough questions for the left in terms of welcoming refugees. The fact of the matter is the most vocal spokespeople for free movement of people, that's not far-left refugee supporting organizations, it's actually a neoliberal capital. And as I said earlier, there is still a world market, and it's not just about migration of people, it's also about capital mobility. The 1% have no interest in stopping that at all. And why would they? Because over the last 30, 40 years, they made record profits by building this global market paradise, and they have no interest in clawing back from NAFTA, sending home immigrants. So where does that leave us on the left? I obviously put myself in a tough position by making the argument that right-wing populism thrives where the left has failed, but I think we simply have to recognize that, and if you don't like the term failure, well then let's say we have been defeated big time since the 1970s. And this is why we are in a tough position, and the challenge is, I think, it's a double challenge. On the one hand, we have to engage with people who vote for, working class people who vote for people like Donald Trump. Anybody on the left, and some are quite happy to distance themselves, putting on display the same kind of elitism that Hillary Clinton put on display in her campaign, and which is why she actually lost the campaign. We can't afford to do that. We have to engage with people who vote for people like Trump and for Brexit and Marine Le Pen, etc., etc. But at the same time, we have to engage with people that are the main target of the right-wing populists, which is minority populations and immigrants doing the most dirty, the most dangerous, and the lowest paid jobs in Western countries. And that's obviously quite a challenge because these people live in rather different worlds. The people supporting Trump are not necessarily the most downtrodden people. More often than not, they're the people who fear to be downgraded to most downtrodden status and don't like to do that. So if you want to talk about a united front, don't talk about it in the sense of building unity between social democratic and communist parties. Communist parties hardly exist, and social democratic parties mostly only exist in name. Talk about it in finding ways to build coalitions between working class people. Yes, maybe the working class is not 99% of the population. It might be between 60 or 65%, but within those 60-65%, you find enormous differences. And not only right-wing populists, but also neoliberal capital is very good at creating such differences. And they're not artificial, they're very real. Whether you have a unionized job or you have a non-union job, whether you are a legal worker or an illegal immigrant, makes a huge difference. So just glossing over that by saying they're all working class, therefore they will follow anybody distributing leaflets saying something about workers unite and fight is not up to speed. We have to take on these differences and try to find common ground despite the real divisions within the working class. That's the challenge.